Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Loris Jarrett, Deputy Financial Secretary, Head of the Public Expenditure Division in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. I will be guiding you through the program's proceedings for this evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this public forum. This forum is being co-hosted by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service and the World Bank. The forum will be examining the topic facing the fiscal risk of natural disasters, and this is with a view to raise public awareness of the nature of the fiscal risks associated with natural disasters and to outline some of the initiatives being pursued by the Government of Jamaica in planning for and managing these risks. At this time, I would like to acknowledge the presence of some of our distinguished guests. We have Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. The Honorable Shahini Robinson, Minister of Labor and Social Security, High Commissioners, Ambassadors, and other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. Jorge Familiar, Regional Vice President of Latin America and the Caribbean for the World Bank, Ms. Tassin Syed, Country Director for Caribbean Countries, Latin America and the Caribbean, Ms. Galina Sotirova, Country Manager for Jamaica, World Bank, and also the moderator for the panel discussion which will come up later on, Ambassador Douglas Saunders, Cabinet Secretary, Permanent Secretaries, members of staff of government departments and agencies, other representatives of multilateral, bilateral, and international institutions, Mr. Mark Golding, Member of Parliament and Opposition Spokesman on Finance and the Public Service, leaders of the private sector, members of the academic community, and members of the media. I welcome you all. We will begin this evening's proceedings with opening remarks by Ms. Tassin Syed, World Bank Country Director for the Caribbean, and she will introduce our main speakers for this evening. Our main speakers are Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, who will speak to the policies and initiatives being put in place by the Government of Jamaica in order to ensure that we can respond effectively to major disasters associated with the increased climate change vulnerability that we are seeing at this time. The other speaker will be Mr. Jorge Familiar, who will be discussing the challenges of building resilience and how the World Bank is supporting countries in this regard. Immediately following the presentations by Dr. Clarke and Mr. Familiar, we will have a panel discussion which will be moderated by Ms. Sotirova, and she will also introduce the members of the panel. The panel discussion will be followed by a question and answer session in which members of the audience will have an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. This session will be followed by the vote of thanks to be delivered by Mr. Trevor Anderson, as you can see on your program. I now invite you to welcome, or to help me to welcome, Ms. Tassin Syed, who will give us the opening remarks. Ms. Syed is a seasoned development professional with over 20 years of operational and leadership experience at the World Bank. She is currently the Country Director for Caribbean Countries in the World Bank And prior to this, she served in managerial positions in Europe, Central and Southern Asia. She holds a master's degree in law and diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Ms. Said. I just want to say that she will then introduce the speakers on conclusion of her opening remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Jarrett, for the welcome. And I apologize to have come to the stage sooner. You had not quite completed. I wasn't expecting that I would be introduced as well with my CV. Thank you very much for that. All protocols observed, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's a personal pleasure and delight to be back in Jamaica this evening to be part of this extremely important discussion that will happen this evening. Let me first begin by saying that 2018 is actually a very special year for us at the World Bank Group because we are marking 55 years of our development partnership with Jamaica. Hence, it's an occasion to celebrate the results the country has accomplished and also for us to, in a very humble way, celebrate our small contribution to those results. Since the inception of our partnership in Jamaica, the World Bank Group has together provided financing close to $3 billion for operations, about 150 operations or so. And these span across the entire spectrum of infrastructure development, macroeconomic support, and most important, human development support for health, education, and social protection. I'm here for a few minutes only, and I wanted to touch upon why today's forum and this event that is actually the brainchild of the finance minister, and we are very grateful for you to have suggested that and to have asked our vice president to come in for this, comes at a very relevant and timely moment for few important reasons. Firstly, let me say that what happens in Jamaica doesn't stay in Jamaica. And the reason it doesn't stay in Jamaica is because Jamaica sets the example and the tone for the rest of the Caribbean nations. And hence, it's extremely important to share the lessons of what Jamaica has accomplished. And the first point really is that the excellent example that this country has demonstrated through, and I think this was mentioned earlier this afternoon when we had a meeting with the president by the finance minister, that the bipartisan political support for macroeconomic reforms across two administrations. And I heard that myself last year when I visited and met across the political spectrum, the leadership. You have actually succeeded in, through prudent fiscal management, to reverse decades-long trend of very high debt, and we know that the numbers, my vice president will also mention that in his presentation, from 150% down to 100% in less than 5 years as we stand here today. And that's a very important number. It's still huge, but the progress is fantastic. We also see that your reserves coverage is rising. The Prime Minister has tweeted about it also recently. And it's a clear testament to the resolve of not just the government of the day, but also of your stakeholders across the country, and including the private sector, to align themselves to the reforms you are embarked on. The second reason why this forum is very timely is that it comes really very close at the heels of, which many of you might be familiar with, the recently released report by the United Nations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which reports on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. This report actually was really, took quite a bit of center stage at the recently concluded World Bank IMF annual meetings in Bali. And here, the key messages from the report, and one that hits very close to the Caribbean states, and especially Jamaica, is that we are already witnessing the consequences of a 1 degree Celsius increase of global warming. Last year's almost twin hurricanes in September were a testament to that. The Category 5 hurricanes. This year, there have been a spate of high flooding in several states in the island states in the region. But the good news is that nations across the Caribbean and also under the leadership of Jamaica are particularly ahead of the curve in wanting to, committed to, and developing actions that are critical for the sustainability of small islands. I do want to mention two more points in relation to Jamaica specifically, that Jamaica has been for several years a front runner among island states in developing resilience against natural disaster. Of course, the glass can never be full, but it is moving towards, at least we see it as a definitely half full glass, and we are proud to be partnering with the efforts of the country in this area. The key part of resilience is physical resilience, and you're starting already with the newly established building codes and regulations. And the reason I mention this is because this physical resilience is significant as these are important steps towards, first, reducing physical vulnerability, second, expanding insurance for homeowners, and thirdly, reducing fiscal costs over time by reducing losses for reconstruction. Also, several efforts are being made for adaptation. That includes ecosystems and coastal resilience and protecting infrastructure against coastal erosion and flooding. So while these are really highly encouraging developments, and I did want to, in the opening remarks, note these developments because it's extremely important that at such events where we are discussing disasters and natural disasters, that we begin with a sort of a feel of encouragement where things are moving forward. So that's why I wanted to acknowledge all the good work that's been done so far. But these are, this is a progress that can be threatened in just one major adverse event. And that's the reason we are standing here and sitting here today. A recently published joint Ministry of Finance and World Bank report highlighted that Jamaica also needs to work towards reducing the fiscal risks associated with natural disasters. And you're going to hear about this today in much more depth by our key speakers and also during the panel discussions. I do want to, before closing, mention that we are extremely grateful as the World Bank Group for the partnership that we receive globally and also in the Caribbean with our development partners ranging from the EU, the UK, Canada, Japan, and all other partners with whom we collaborate, including multilaterals such as the IDB. And in this connection, there will be also an important event in Washington, D.C., jointly coordinated by IMF, World Bank, and the IDB on building resilience against disasters. You will be hearing a lot more on a 360-degree approach to disaster management and enhancing resilience that we are now looking at, encompassing not just infrastructure, but fiscal, financial, environmental, and human capital, human development resilience. At this time, I would like to introduce our two key speakers. Let me begin by first introducing, and I think you, sir, need no introduction in this forum, but I would still do that. The Right Honorable Nigel Clarke, Minister of Finance and the Public Service, who assumed office as Minister of Finance in March 2018, following his successful election to the Assembly, to the Parliament in the last elections. Previously, we have been engaging very deeply with you as advisor to the Prime Minister and also as Ambassador Plenipotentiary for Economic Affairs and Vice Chairman of the Economic Growth Council, established by the government. Dr. Clarke has held several important roles in the public and private sector, and that is really the key strength that he brings is his exposure and experience in the private sector as chairman of various bodies and authorities. He's a graduate of the University of the West Indies and a Rhodes Scholar, and we discovered recently that you are an expert mathematician. You're DPhil in numerical analysis from the University of Oxford. This was a recent discovery, so I thought I must mention that, for me at least. Second, let me introduce Mr. Jorge Familiar, who has been actually the regional vice president, the first regional vice president in 30 years from Latin America region to head the Latin American Caribbean program in the World Bank. At the risk of being admonished after this event by my boss, I will say that he wants to be introduced now as the Vice President of the Caribbean and Latin America region. Mr. Familiar leads the relationship with the highest level of government and across our stakeholders and our program, the financial program and advisory engagement of over $30 billion in around 33 countries of the region, of which a very large number are from the Caribbean countries, of course. Since 2010, this is his second vice presidential appointment at the World Bank. He was vice president and corporate secretary of the World Bank Group from 2010 till 2014, where the key role that Mr. Familiar played was facilitating dialogue and promoting cooperation between the board and the management of the World Bank. So there can be no better person to coordinate the engagement for Jamaica between the various stakeholders on the objectives that the country wants to move towards. Let me close by saying that Mr. Jorge Familiar has been personally championing the agenda of resilience in the Caribbean region for several years, and more so after the last year's what I call the twin Category 5 hurricanes, and on especially looking at developing innovative financing solutions. So warm welcome to everyone. I know you welcomed everyone, but let me, on behalf of the World Bank, especially say that we are humbled and honored to be invited to join this event with you and to be present here. Thank you very much.
And now if I can ask Minister Clark, to come to the podium for his presentation.
Madam Master of Ceremonies, Ministers of Government, I believe Minister Shahini Robinson is here, members of the Diplomatic Corps, I know the EU Ambassador is here, the High Commissioner from Canada is here, I believe the head of USAID is here, and the Ambassador from Japan is here, members of Parliament, and I see Member of Parliament Mark Golding, welcome. Leadership of the World Bank, our special guest, Vice President of the World Bank and my good friend, Jorge Familiar. Please give him a big round of applause and welcome him to Jamaica. Jorge is a leader and we want to claim him as our Vice President. We have our own Vice President at the World Bank. Permanent secretaries, leaders in the public sector and in the private sector, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good afternoon. And no man, look at the set. You can't say good afternoon in a set like that. I mean, this looks more like the X Factor than a conference on disaster, right? I guess that's the idea. I've been looking for my chance, If those reality shows were around when I was a teenager, I'm sure, as we say in Jamaica, I'd have bust by now. So I'm delighted to have a full audience for a discussion on this topic. Jamaica is doing very well. Poverty is at an 11-year low. Growth in the first quarter of the financial year is the highest it has been in a decade for the first quarter. Inflation has been stable and low for a number of years. And the latest news is that unemployment came out last week at the lowest level ever recorded in Jamaica. I literally went back and checked the records myself. And as far back as we could go, went back as beyond 40 years. And the persons at Staten have confirmed the lowest level ever recorded. Now, as great as that is, we all know from experience that that could be eroded. Oh, and I should say debt has gone down from 147% of GDP to be on target to being below 100 for the first time this century. Yeah? But as wonderful as that is, and that of course reflects an effort over consecutive administrations, as wonderful as that is, it could disappear overnight in a single event. We had a little experience with it last year with the rains that fell in Montego Bay. In one day, there was more rain in one day in Montego Bay than over what normally takes place over 7 months. And the drains were full and the city was flooded. We lost money, businesses lost money, there was a fiscal cost. So the vulnerability of Jamaica to devastation of natural disasters is well known. We know it from our experience. The earthquake in Haiti in 2010, we remember that. We remember what happened in Dominica last year. The cost was over 250% of GDP. Natural disasters destroy our crops, they destroy our homes, they suppress revenue. It means in the aftermath of a natural disaster, you have to import a lot of stuff, and therefore your foreign exchange comes under pressure at exactly the wrong time. Expenditures go up. It just takes you completely off track. You make 3 steps forward only to make 5 steps backwards. We can no longer take the approach that we have taken in the past of just dealing with it when it happens. Because to do so is a recipe for dependency. And hence, X factor set. Because we have to begin to speak about this in an explicit way and in a real way. A recent World Bank study on the financing of natural disasters shows that the regularity and severity of natural disasters that have hit Jamaica since 1988, and I think I have a chart on this, resulted in average annual losses of about 2.3% of GDP. We all know the names there on the x-axis. You know, Gilbert estimated at 26% of GDP in some in PIOJ reports. But then we had Charlie in 2004, 3.5%. We had Ivan, 5.7% in 2004. Dennis, Wilma, Dean, Gustav, Nicole, Sandy. We have all lived through that. And our risk profile includes low-impact events as well that occur more frequently. Now, all of these have to be financed. All of the costs that come from this, the money has to come from somewhere to pay. And the regularity with which we have been having these experiences suggests that we need to plan for it and not deal with it in an ad hoc way. Most of the way in which these natural disaster occurrences are financed is by diversion of budgetary allocation. So money is allocated to ministries, departments, and agencies, allocated to important infrastructure projects, and in the event of a natural disaster, that money is diverted. Critical expenditure gets left behind. And as a result, our social and economic development is retarded. We have other approaches on the books now. We have the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance, that insures us on a parametric basis for losses once they meet a certain level of severity. We're very pleased to complete negotiations for a contingent credit facility that you might hear more about later with the Inter-American Development Bank. But that's essentially about what we have in our arsenal, and it leaves several gaps exposed. Our public bodies, some of them insure, but not on a complete basis. We have ministries and schools and hospitals, all of which are uninsured, right? The cost of insuring them just prohibitively high. So the crux of the matter is the manner in which disaster risk is financed has got to change. It has not been very effective. If we move to the next chart, just a diagram of what the profile looks like. If you look on this, on the X, we have the severity of a natural disaster, and vertically we have the frequency. And one way to think about what we want to do from a strategic perspective is for things that are high frequency, we retain the risk in Jamaica and try to finance it ourselves through possibly a number of methods, having a natural disaster fund possibly, having, the capacity for post-disaster borrowing, reallocation of budgetary resources, and so forth. Once the frequency is less and the severity is likely to be higher, then we need to look at transferring the risk in ways that are market-driven. And this just shows two of these, contingent credit and CRIF. There should have been one or two others, catastrophe bonds where that green is, or CAT DDOs, or many other instruments. And there'll always be a layer of residual risk that exists that's undiversifiable. But this just represents an illustration of the kind of strategic approach that we're going to need to take. And as I said, where it is green, just imagine a couple other rows that include other products as we go up on severity and down on frequency. Now, the approach that we want to take or plan to take is not one that immediately jumps for a product. It's easy to buy a catastrophe bond in the market. Any international investment bank, would sell you a catastrophe bond tomorrow, or to sell you other risk transfer instruments. How we want to approach it is to develop a policy first on which we can have national consensus, because these things cost, and because they cost, because it's ultimately a fiscal cost, it's important that we have some amount of consensus that we do want to make an explicit arrangement for these exposures. And once we have a strategy in place that has gone through the policy building steps, after that we engage in the purchase of products. Now, what makes this all very challenging is that Jamaica has very limited fiscal space. One of the charts earlier sort of showed the fixed and discretionary expenditure, and a chart that I have spoken about before and has been in the public domain, that even though our discretionary expenditure the room for it has been improving, and discretionary expenditure includes expenditure that you actually have discretion over, right? Most of our budget consists of compensation, salaries, pension, wages, and interest. And only a minority of it consists of things that you can actually make a decision over, and much of it is absorbed in capital expenditure and other things that are required. So in the reality of limited fiscal space, the urgency of the situation becomes even more apparent, that it is absolutely necessary to take a strategic approach. In addition to addressing the problem by means of transferring of risk through purchasing of product, it is also possible to spend ex ante, to spend before a disaster on resilience and on mitigation. It has been shown that $1 invested in making Jamaica more resilient to natural disasters provide benefits that are probably 3 times as great. A good example of mitigation would have been the Palisadoes shoreline project, where the road is at sea level and can easily be overwhelmed in a natural disaster, and overwhelming, of a road such as that, making it impassable, could inflict further costs on Jamaica by making disaster relief supplies difficult to get to their intended recipients, and so forth. And therefore, the money spent to make that resilient is money well spent. The challenge, though, is that if you look at the range of options available to make our infrastructure more resilient, that cost is staggering. Putting all of our electricity lines underground, for example, which would be a great thing to be able to do to make our country more resilient, comes at a staggering price. So the strategic approach that we're going to have to take, not only does it need to balance what we spend today versus what we spend tomorrow reallocating our budget, but it also has to balance what we spend on risk transfer versus what we spend on resilience. So I'm pleased to announce, and it was announced by press release earlier today, that the Cabinet at its last meeting has approved the development of a national natural disaster risk financing policy. That deserves a round of applause. And the policy will target both pre-disaster, meaning mitigation and resilience measures, and post-disaster risk transfer measures on how to plan for and better finance damages and losses so that natural disasters don't derail us from our objectives. And the World Bank is providing support on a technical basis, and the IDB is providing significant grant funding, and we hope to involve the IMF as far as ensuring that the strategies and plans that we put in place are consistent with our overall debt and growth objectives. The policy will provide the strategic context that allows us to prioritize these investments, and the process will be overseen by the appropriate steering committees and so forth, and importantly, it will involve stakeholders throughout society. We plan for the initial policy preparation and analysis to occur by January, and for public consultation on a green paper by March of next year, and hope to be able to proceed to, this is a very aggressive but necessary timeline, because we want to ensure that prior to the expiration of our current standby arrangement with the fund, we have at least a strategy in place. It takes time for a strategy to be executed, for sure, but we want to make sure that at least prior to October of 2019, we have a policy in place that's been tabled in Parliament, debated in Parliament, and accepted, and becomes our national disaster financing risk policy. And as Jamaica continues to do well, as growth continues and unemployment continues to decrease or remain at current levels, and the stability that we've enjoyed continues to be entrenched, and fiscal space opens up, we'll be able to engage in more resilience and more risk transfer. But until such time, we are going to engage members of the multilateral community to see what creative ways and creative things that we can work on to ensure that Jamaica can reduce its exposure as much as possible, even while we build the fiscal room to do it all ourselves. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a productive discussion.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we now invite Mr. Jorge Familiar, who has already been introduced, to make his presentation.
Thank you so much, Minister Clark, ministers, ambassadors, colleagues, partners. Well, I am the Vice President for the Caribbean at the World Bank. I also, at times, look into Latin America. I promise I will keep focusing on the Caribbean, and there is a reason for that. There is a reason for that. Small states, small island states face very particular challenges, challenges that require attention, challenges that require solutions which are specific to their needs. My presentation right now is going to be very easy because I practically need to say that I agree with everything that has been said. In fact, 97% of what I was going to say has already been said. So if this sounds repetitive, it's because it is, no? So first, we are celebrating 55 years of partnership with Jamaica, which is something we are very proud of and very happy of. This engagement has been very deep and in many areas and many fields. But right now, Jamaica, and in particular Minister Clark, is pushing us into new territory and new boundaries. You see, Jamaica is bringing together two key elements for the development of small island states. And Jamaica is changing the way we approach a very sensitive and complex issue, which is environmental resilience. And Jamaica is doing so by bringing together to the conversation also the importance of fiscal resilience. Minister Clark told us that Jamaica is doing very well, and we couldn't agree more. In fact, we commend Jamaica for all the success on the macroeconomic front. But you know, that is because Jamaica has worked extremely hard to be where they are today. This has not been a free lunch. There is an enormous effort by the Jamaican government, by the Jamaican parliament, by the Jamaican people to have moved from where they were just a decade ago, 5 years ago, to where they are today. And that generates an enormous amount of confidence from the international institutions, from the international community on the success, on the future success of Jamaica. And, you know, we need to recognize these efforts. And we need to recognize what it takes to adjust on the fiscal front, as Jamaica has done for such a long period of time. At the same time, Jamaica, as all Caribbean nations, is exposed to environmental hazards. It's exposed to potential natural disasters. And look, I don't need to tell you what this is about, no? I mean, we all saw it last year. 2 Category 5 hurricanes. One was the biggest. The other one was the fastest forming. In fact, we were in the United Nations having a conference to discuss how we could support the countries that have been damaged by Irma when a tropical storm turned into a Category 1 hurricane. In the middle of the conference, it was a Category 3. By the end of the conference, it was a Category 5. And in the evening, it was on top of Dominica. And in the same 2 weeks, we had 2 earthquakes in Mexico. So you see, this is the environment that, of course, is not climate related, but it's the kind of disasters that our countries are at risk of. So this is the environment. Also, for an institution like ours, who has the mandate to eradicate poverty or support countries in the eradication of poverty, it is the most vulnerable, it is the poorest that are most affected by these disasters. So building resilience needs to be at the center of the development agenda of Caribbean nations. And that is exactly what Jamaica is doing. There has been lots of innovation, thanks to people like Minister Clark that keep pushing us to come up with new ideas and to think outside the box and to come up with new things. So we have created contingent lines of credit for catastrophes. We have created catastrophe bonds. We have created the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility. So lots of innovation. But the real challenge today is bringing all this toolkit that we have and putting it together with a financial management toolkit. And we talk about resilience as 360 degrees, and I could present it like that. I'm still struggling with the geometric description of resilience. I'm going to try something different. I see it as a task of 3 pillars. One of the pillars is disaster risk preparedness. The other one is building physical resilience, and the third one is building financial resilience or a financial safety net. And then there's a foundation. And the foundation is understanding the risk. The very first step is understanding the risks that we're facing. If we understand the risk, we will be able to put together a comprehensive response to build resilience in all fronts. And we all know that with climate change, the severity of storms is going to increase, and we all know that the frequency of storms is going to increase. The risk matrix is shifting. If things that were going to happen every 10 years are now going to happen every 5, it's going to be very hard to obtain insurance against those. So we will need to build physical resilience to face those risks. But then, if storms are going to be more severe, every 50 or 100 years, there will be some massive events for which we will need a very robust financial safety net. So that is what we need to put together. This also means something that Minister Clark mentioned. If we are going to see more of this, we cannot leave this conversation to chance. And we cannot deal with disasters exposed. We cannot wait until the storm hits and then see how we respond to it. So we need to improve on disaster risk preparedness. We need to monitor more. We need to communicate better, because it's not just the government that needs to understand risks. It's the whole population that needs to understand risks. Look, I come from Mexico. In 1985, there was a very significant earthquake. The official death toll of the earthquake is 5,000 people. Buildings throughout the city fell down. After that, building codes were improved. Civil protection systems were put in place. Communications campaigns went into action. Yearly drills have been taking place. Last year, one of the 2 earthquakes was as strong as the one we had in 1985. And there were tragedies, 350 deaths, but not 5,000. Not so many buildings came down. So resilience was built. So this can be done. And this is part of the agenda. Now, building better also becomes a must. So building physical resilience is going to be key, particularly to face more frequent and not necessarily high severity events. And then we also need to work on our financial safeguards. So on physical resilience, let me share with you how I see the issue. I think that countries, we cannot disassociate the need to strengthen our physical assets with the need to be very prudent on the fiscal front. So if a country like Jamaica is going through a fiscal consolidation process, it's going to be very hard to devote the amount of resources that are needed to build physical resilience in a very short period of time. So it will take time. It is the ultimate solution, but it will take time. The second issue is, how do we go about building physical resilience? I think it's fundamental that countries start thinking about which are the critical assets, and then establishing priorities on which assets need to be strengthened first. And here I think that there are 2 principles. One of the principles has to be securing human lives, no? Because in the end, what we want to make sure is not lost with a disaster is human life. So thinking, for example, about shelters and having shelters which are strong enough and are readily available before the disaster hit has to be one of the priorities. And then we also need to put, on a list of what are the critical assets and which have to be strengthened and in which order. And then another critical element is going to be crowding in the private sector. Because if we have few fiscal resources and we have an urgent need to strengthen infrastructure, one way to go about doing it is by bringing in the private sector when it is possible. And then there's the issue of the financial safety net. It has to be multi-layered. I think that in order to make costs manageable, the very first steps of this financial safety net have to come from government savings, catastrophe funds that countries create, then contingent credit lines like the one Jamaica is working on with the IDB, and then insurance, risk transfer mechanisms like the minister was mentioning. Here we have one which, by the way, has set an example for the world. It is a global public good which was created in the Caribbean, which is the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility, which is the first multi-country insurance platform to face environmental risks. So we need to keep strengthening that component. And then working on other mechanisms. One are the catastrophe bonds. We will have time to talk more about those at some point. But then, there's space to think about other things, no? Like, for example, in debt issuances, ensuring the payment of interest in case a disaster hits a country. I would like to just say 2 words of caution on two things. No? One is on insurance, and the other one is on national catastrophe funds. No? So, ex-ante losses are deceiving because they are averages, you see? And anyone can drown in 1 meter of water on average. No? And the same happens with ex-ante expected losses. When the disaster materializes, the losses are not 0.4% of GDP on average. They are of 240% of GDP. So you see, insurance matters. Insurance is expensive, and when you pay it, no one is particularly happy of disbursing. But the day you need it, then you understand why you had it. So that is something that countries need to keep in mind and that the population needs to understand. And the second one applies to disaster funds. And here we need always to apply a principle that I call the lead us not into temptation principle. You see, countries start saving and funds start accumulating and the disaster doesn't happen. And then temptation kicks in. Why don't we use this money to, pay for the improvement of this or for this payroll or to expand this other thing? And then the disaster hits and you don't have the resources. So I do think that these 2 principles need to be sort of like cast in stone when it comes to the financial safety net. And then finally, I think that there is a very important role to play for the international community in support specifically of Jamaica, because they have done the homework, but they are exposed. And between today and the day in which Jamaica will be able to invest more strongly on building physical resilience, the international community, in my opinion, should lean forward and support Jamaica in covering on the financial safety net front. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Familiar. And I would like to just say that we have had a lot of food for thought from both presentations, and I trust that you will hold your questions for the Q&A session that will come up later on. But I now invite Galino to come forward and the panelists to make their way to the stage for the next segment, which is the panel discussion.
Good evening, everyone. We've heard from the minister, we heard from our vice presidents, and then one theme, a lot of, as Mr. Familiar was saying, a lot of the same ideas were floating in the different speeches, but for me, one common thread was very and particularly important. As the minister said, it is important to have a really strategic approach to addressing the risk. And Mr. Familiar also said that it's very important to look at it, from, he doesn't like the 360, but the point is to look at the risk, from the different perspectives and have a comprehensive framework, to address this risk. So I am very happy that now we have a panel which would help us to look at this risk from many different, from different perspectives. And I would like to introduce, part of the panel is of course Minister Clark, Mr. Familiar, but I would like to introduce the other panel members. And I will start by Dr. Constant Longheng. I always called you Constant, so I'm not sure how you pronounce your name. And as most of you know, Constant is the IMF resident representative for Jamaica. He joined the IMF in 2010 and has since worked in the Institute of Capacity Development, the Fiscal Affairs Department, the African Department, and the Western Hemisphere Department. His recent research has covered a range of issues, including the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy, fiscal anchors and risks, and the political economy of reform. Early in his career, he was a statistician at the National Institute of Statistics of Cameroon. He holds degrees from the University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, the Economic School of Louvain in Belgium, and a PhD in economics from the University of Montreal, Canada. So please join me in welcoming Constant as the panel. Another distinguished panelist tonight is Mr. Yuri Chakalal, who is the Senior Specialist in Natural Disaster and Risk Management at the Inter-American Development Bank. And Yuri comes with 22 years of experience in coastal resource management, environmental planning, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian assistance. His experience spans across the public, private, civil society, and international development sectors throughout the Caribbean. He served as a disaster risk management advisor with the Caribbean Development Bank, with UNDP in Nepal, and with the Canadian International Development Agency. He served also as the coastal planner for the Government of Barbados. Mr. Chakalal has degrees from the Faculty of Natural Sciences and the Marine Resource and Environmental Management Program of the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados. Please help me welcome him. And to my immediate left, we have Major Clive Davis. I think that he doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I will go ahead with the introduction. He has been the Director General of OPEM, Jamaica, since February 2015, where he leads the disaster risk management agenda for Jamaica. In this role, Major Davis serves as the coordinating focal point for the activities of private and public actors in disaster risk reduction and is the chief advisor to the Government of Jamaica on matters of risk management and risk management. Major Clive Davis is a former member of the Jamaica Defense Force, where he served for almost 2 decades. He received military training at the Royal Canadian School of Infantry Combat Training Center in Cagetown, Canada, and the School of Infantry, Warminster, the UK. Major Davis founded the Safety and Emergency Management Systems, Jamaica's first occupational safety and health and emergency management consultancy, which I found very important to mention, just to underscore, the need to bring on board on this agenda very broadly, the public, from, the personal individual level, to professional organizations, private sector, government, and the public broadly. So in the first round, I will have one question for each panelist, and would ask panelists to be concise and keep their interventions to 5 minutes. We are a little bit behind already, and we have timekeepers who will keep us in check. So let me start with Constant. The frequency of natural disasters is increasing, as is the severity of the natural disasters. And addressing these risks entails significant costs, and the costs keep increasing as well. So is there a trade-off between addressing this risk, building resilience in all the different aspects of resilience, and then maintaining debt and fiscal sustainability and growth?
Thank you, Galina. The short answer is no, but there is no trade-off. We need both. Let me maybe try to elaborate as to why. I'm very glad to be here. I'm glad that after being a champion of fiscal consolidation, Jamaica is now taking the leadership in managing fiscal risk emanating from natural disasters. I remember exactly 1 year ago, IMF Managing Director, Madame Christine Lagarde, was visiting Jamaica in the context of the Caribbean Forum. And at the time, she pledged to convene a conference on resilience building. And I'm glad that this is happening towards the end of this month, and Jamaica is playing a key role in that conference by showcasing exactly what Minister Clark has just highlighted. I'm also glad that the World Bank, which has been doing a lot of work, not only in Jamaica, but across the world and the region, in resilience building and financing instrument, it's jointly organizing that conference with the IMF and also the IDB. So you will probably hear a lot of noise coming out of Washington in the next 3 weeks in that regard. I mean, fiscal risk management, it's at the core center of any policy making. The reason being that when we think about macroeconomic dynamics, people tend to focus on averages. But those averages, as Mr. Familiar has just mentioned, ex ante, they may look small, but when you hit by a shock, the impact can be very large. And in real life, we don't think about averages. Think about your car insurance. You're doing sure for your car, not because you will not be able, ex ante, you can be a good driver, but ex post, someone may hit you down the road, or you may find yourself in an unfortunate situation. So countries do need to plan against risks, because also, as Minister Clark mentioned, when you are hit by those risks, by those shocks, is the time when you need your resource the most, and that's when you don't have those resources. So it's a critical pillar of any policy making. And I would even say that Jamaica started fiscal risk management since 2013, because one way to edge yourself against risk is to work down your debt arithmetics. Because when you're hit by a shock, if your debt to GDP is 60% of, if your debt is 60% of GDP, it's a whole different ball game than if your debt is 100% of GDP. So to me, to my mind, debt reduction in and of itself, it's part of the fiscal risk management, and I'm glad that Jamaica has set an example in that regard. Having debt going down from 147% of GDP to going below 100% at the end of this fiscal year. It's clearly amazing, and it's part of that fiscal risk management effort. And we see that across the board, how much Jamaica is able to borrow at which rate, 100 basis points below average emerging market, meaning that when Jamaica needs resources, they could be tapped at a lower cost. But obviously, when you are faced by a big shock, this may put a threat to your debt sustainability, and I think that's where your credibility also plays a big role. So by entrenching macroeconomic stability and fiscal discipline, Jamaica has already embarked on fiscal risk management. So this is not new territory to Jamaica, but at the same time, entrenching that reality, as Minister Clark, under the leadership of Minister Clark, is clearly key going forward. So, yes, Galina, what I said starting off is there is no trade-off. We really need both. We need to think about fiscal risk. There is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to fiscal risk. The way you think about fiscal risk when your debt is at 60% of GDP is not the same way you think about fiscal risk when you still have a debt burden of 100+% of GDP. So those considerations have to be looked at in the context of the overall direction of public debt reduction that Jamaica has embarked on. I'm sure we will discuss in details what are the different strategies, fiscal strategies that countries can use to hedge against natural disaster risk. But I'm glad that Jamaica is well within that thinking, and I'm particularly glad that this is happening well ahead of the exit from fund financial arrangement, and the focus on building institutions, it's certainly a key pillar in that endeavor.
Thank you very much. Now I'll turn to Mr. Chacalal. Yuri, the IDB is helping the Caribbean countries in addressing risk of disasters. You know, what is concretely the support that you're providing to Jamaica in terms of addressing those risks and those issues?
Thank you, Galina, and thanks for the invitation. IDB is working on a number of fronts, a number of diverse fronts to support Jamaica with respect to disaster risk management. The most recent thing is the approval of the contingent credit facility, which just happened last month at our board. And this is effectively a line of finance that's determined ex ante, a financial raincoat, if you will, which allows the country to have access, should it need it, for emergency, the emergency finance required for responding to a disaster event or undertaking emergency rehabilitation. Part of the, so this product actually fits quite nicely under the policy that we heard about from Dr. Clark, and I think it's really fantastic. I mean, Jamaica should be congratulated for putting that thinking and that framework into place, and the World Bank for assisting it in that direction. I mean, we are happy to contribute with the contingent credit facility as one instrument. But in addition to that, part of the construct of the contingent credit facility by the IDB is that the country must maintain a comprehensive disaster risk management program where it sets its own goals for risk governance, emergency preparedness and response, risk reduction, risk transfer, recovery planning, and the bank extends this facility on that condition. So annexed to the contingent credit facility is the fact that the country is committing to also undertaking its own resilience programming and identifying its own targets in terms of these facets of disaster risk management.
Thank you very much. I mean, basically what you're underscoring is the importance of having a national policy, national program And as was mentioned already by, by Mr. Familiar, it's important that the country is taking the lead on those things, and then the development partners come and support those efforts. But the leadership of the government and the existence of a comprehensive strategy and a program is very important. And in that sense, Jamaica is one of the leaders in the Caribbean.
Absolutely. In fact, just to build on what Mr. Familiar said, particularly on the foundation of risk assessment, this is one of the things that we're working with Jamaica on. We have done in 2014 a probabilistic risk assessment, which looks at the probable occurrence of hazards of different magnitudes and the likely economic losses at different, for different sectors. And what we're doing is trying to redo some of that work, update some of that work now in 2018, 2019, bringing in climate change. And what we're seeing preliminarily is that the asset exposure, both public and private assets back in 2014, around 19 billion, and around now in 2018, 2019, and a significant change around 35 billion in terms of asset exposure. So what we would like to encourage and promote is really more of the utilization of the risk assessment in the investment planning and day-to-day decision making. It's a very good instrument for doing that. And I think the World Bank has done some similar work, and the numbers between IDB and World Bank in terms of total asset exposure for Jamaica isn't that far off. We're in the same ballpark.
Thank you. Major Davis, a dollar spent, they say that a dollar spent in resilience means less for reconstruction, later on, right? You are responsible for reconstruction, rebuilding, disaster response after the disaster happens. So would you say that by investing in resilience now we are taking away what we would need if disaster hits tomorrow?
Okay. Thank you so very much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Let me just say, though, that the concepts are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they complement each other. It has been proven that investment in resilience is far, far more cost-effective than mounting that response and rehabilitation activity. So, in simple terms, what is resilience? Resilience speaks to our capacity to recover, our capacity to bounce back. And much of that speaks to that thing called mitigation. Mitigation in itself speaks to what it is, what is it that we can do to reduce the impact of a hazard on persons, what it is that we can do to prevent the hazard or to reduce the occurrence of the hazard. And in the disaster risk management world, we are convinced that the more we do up front is the less we have to do on the back end. In fact, High Commissioner, right, where I studied in Canada, we were taught in the military that the more you sweat in peace is the less you bleed in war. And so let me give you an example here. The Mandela Highway is being renovated, and I know it's been a challenge for a lot of us. But when you look at what is being done on the Mandela Highway, the aim and what it is that we expect to get at the end of the day, you will realize that this is resilience up front. We're putting mitigation measures in place. hitherto, you would have a rainfall event, and persons cannot move out of the city, persons cannot come into the city. What if we had a major impact in Portmore? How would those persons be able to evacuate and move into Kingston? What if we had an impact outside of the city? How would we move goods and products from our major port, airport, and seaport out? What we have done is put provisions in place to deal with those issues long before they become a challenge for us. There's a major project that is now being funded by, yes, one of our development partners, right, which speaks to sea defenses. Studies are being done in coastal towns where we're looking at the vulnerability. And when we look at those vulnerabilities, then we're able to put in place measures to mitigate. Those measures might be hard, seawalls. They might be soft, mangrove. The reality of that situation, though, is that here we have a coastline that will be protected. We have a beach that will be protected. Private and public property, which will be protected. And most importantly, lives and livelihoods. That is what we would like to see more of, Minister. We have some overseas examples, ladies and gentlemen. A study of 4 Caribbean states recently suggested that the rebuilding effort after a shock was going to be doubling the mitigation costs. But let me go further afield. In Mozambique, there was an impact. And it was found that a flood impact, the recovery effort was going to be 203% of what they requested previously in mitigation. And so, yes, it is said that cost benefits, about every dollar you invest, you save about $4 to $7. And I believe it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important that we put the effort up front. It is very important that we put mitigation, that we put resilience up front, so that you can work me out of a job.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Oops. It's okay. I'd like to turn back to Mr. Familiar and then talk a little bit, ask him to talk a little bit more about, you mentioned in your keynote presentation about innovative solutions that have been tried and structured for financing in other countries and where the bank has been also helping. So given these experiences of innovative approaches to financing like the Pacific Alliance and then the CRIF that you talked about, what would be your suggestions, for the small Caribbean states, including Jamaica, of how to approach it?
Well, so when it comes to risk transfer mechanisms, the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility clearly was an innovation, and by now it's a very well-established innovation. It keeps evolving by inviting other countries. Now Central American countries are also eligible. That allows for better risk diversification and therefore lowering the cost for everyone. That's positive. It's also expanding the types of coverage that it offers. So there is always innovation on the CRIF front. But I also mentioned cat bonds. Cat bonds are actually bonds issued by a AAA rated agency, in this case the World Bank, as part of our normal funding operations that have attached to them insurance policies. So investors that do not want to take on credit risk but want to be exposed to other types of risks buy these instruments. And believe me, there are investors interested in buying these types of things. No? So the market is not an extremely deep market. It's not something too common, but Mexico has been successful in issuing cat bonds. In fact, one of the 2 earthquakes that took place last year triggered a cat bond that had just been issued a few months before, and there was payment. The way the insurance policy works is parametric, just like the CRIF. And last year there was a major innovation because we, together with the Pacific Alliance countries, issued the very first multi-country cat bond in history. And again, by going together, the 4 countries saved money, both on issuance cost and also on premium, because the risks were not correlated. Now, look, since Minister Clark is, asking us to keep moving the frontier forward, I mean, we all wake up in the middle of the night thinking of what else can we do, no? And some of the things that we're exploring now is how about, bonds that when issued have a clause that gives a certain holiday to the debtor in case a disaster hits, no? And this holiday could be covered through insurance. It would be something similar to a cat bond, or maybe it could be, a restructuring clause. So these are some of the things that we are thinking about. And then, just yesterday, before taking a plane to start my trip over here, we were discussing, and why not do something like this for multilateral financing as well, right? I mean, after all, we are doing it for refugees. We have the Global Concessional Financing Facility, which is a fund created by donors to improve the terms of financing for countries which are receiving refugees. You could do something similar to support countries when they face disasters, no? Soften the terms of finance by multilaterals or bilaterals in case a disaster hits. So I do think that there is a lot of room for innovative thinking in this field.
Thank you very much. And it's indeed, now we're talking about the CRIF as something that exists out there, and then we are all in the Caribbean. We know it is there. It's paying immediately, providing cash, to the countries. A few years ago, that was the biggest innovation in the world. And there's a good thing in the challenges that the Caribbean face. The Caribbean faces the challenges of vulnerability, but this does push us to be more creative and to be more innovative. So, Minister Clark, we were saying that, I just mentioned that the Caribbean is at the forefront of, the innovative thinking in terms of disaster risk with the CRIF, with other ideas. Right now, everybody has acknowledged that Jamaica is the front runner in the Caribbean in the thinking, and not only thinking but putting in place the elements of a comprehensive strategy and approach to managing these risks. So how do you see the role actually in Jamaica in the Caribbean on this agenda?
Well, first thing, we need to keep Jorge in Jamaica for a little longer. The longer he stays, I like the sound of the things he's saying. Jamaica, repeat the last part, how is Jamaica?
How do you see the role of Jamaica?
In the region,
there is a lot
sure.
of things happening here. So how can Jamaica, Tassim was saying, what happens in Jamaica doesn't stay in Jamaica, but how can Jamaica help the rest of the Caribbean, in pushing that agenda as well?
So the risks that we identified earlier are common to the Caribbean. Jamaica has had its share of experiences, as many other countries in the Caribbean have. What we intend to do is, we believe that if we are, successfully put a policy such as the one I described in place and follow it up by engaging the multilateral community in the procurement of products in that quadrant that can help transfer risk and do so in a creative way with the international community, we believe that that will catalyze other countries in the Caribbean to think in a similar way. And the next round could be something that is multi-country. And when it becomes multi-country, costs go down for everyone, and the size could potentially increase. But we think that we need to get something done, lead, and others will come on board. Those conversations, certainly when I speak with my counterparts in other Caribbean countries, the path that Jamaica is on, others want to follow and want to replicate what we're doing. And if we can get this done, I have no doubt that we'll have others coming behind us, but more importantly, we'll probably be able to do something collaboratively. And who knows, it may not only be the English-speaking Caribbean. I mean, I see the Dominican Republic ambassador here. It could involve non-full member CARICOM countries such as the Dominican Republic. And that is why I believe that the multilateral community and the international community have a vested interest in Jamaica's success in this regard, because our success in this regard can be leveraged, and can be leveraged to bring others in, and not just in the Caribbean, but in the region, and not just in the region, but with other small island developing states.
Thank you very much. It's indeed, Minister Clark is pushing us, to push the frontier, to push the envelope, not only in the thinking, but I think that that's a challenge for all of us international development partners. I mean, if we help Jamaica succeed, then it would be a good example and a good mechanism to bring other countries on board. So, thank you for pushing us.
If I may just add, Jamaica has taken responsibility for the problems it found itself in. The problems we found ourselves in a few years ago are by no means unique. Absolutely. Suddenly, the world woke up this year, for the first half of this year, emerging market bonds took a battering, because the world woke up and said, wait a minute, there's a lot of sovereign exposure because countries are heavily indebted, and emerging market bonds took a massive hit, and Jamaica was steady. We have taken responsibility, and we have had great success in doing so. If a country takes responsibility, bears sacrifice, sweats in peace, and then is still exposed, and everybody looks and says, well, you're on your own, what incentive will there be for other countries to do what Jamaica has done? So we say to you, multilaterals, and you in the international community, you have a vested interest in our success. Yeah.
Thank you so much. At this point, I would open up for questions from the audience. And we have 2 mics, I think standing mics. And I would like to ask you to move to the mics. And when you move to the mics, no, they're not standing. So we have people who are moving the mics. So you just raise your hand. So when you get to the mic, please introduce yourself. Be very concise, and then indicate to whom your question is. It could be a short question, it could be a short comment. Short is important. And please keep to, I mean, you have such a distinguished panel, and I think that a lot of people might be tempted to ask questions that are keeping them at night, or, you know, that are not related to the topic. But please keep your questions and comments to the topic that we are discussing. And members of the media, if there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions to individual panel members. So if you wish to do so, you should go and talk to Marcia Erskine, Christelle Chapois, who is our colleague, and Elaine from the Ministry of Finance. There she is, Elaine. There is a little corner here which will be available for short interviews, a few questions, so please indicate your interest to the three communications specialists that we have. Thank you. Yeah, Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. This afternoon's session, first of all, I want to congratulate the Minister of Finance and the World Bank.
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know you, but...
I'm Eleanor Jones, Environmental Solutions Limited, an environment and disaster risk management specialist, having worked in the region, Yuri will tell you, for many, many years. This evening's presentation is an awesome presentation for me. It is something that we have been talking about for years and years, and so to see it happening is really wonderful. And I really want to congratulate you for beginning to look at the whole issue of financial loss with respect to the environmental risk and natural hazards that we face. We have suffered, not only in infrastructure. As we talk about damage and loss, we tend to pay attention to infrastructure. We have not really figured out how to deal with individual loss, personal loss, the whole business of poverty reduction each time we have an event that destroys assets at the individual, the personal level. So this is a wonderful start, and again, I just want to say thanks, and I want to endorse the point, all the points that have been made, but particularly the point that Yuri made with respect to environmental risk being integrated into investment planning. Because I'm afraid that with all the talking that we're doing, we're still not doing that to a sufficiently high degree. And I think it's very important as we move forward, as we attempt to put this framework into place, we look at the underlying risk factors with whatever it is that we're doing, and we integrate that into the investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I guess that this is just a suggestion to keep in mind and no specific question, right? Yeah. Yeah, comment. So other?
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Robert Stevens, representing Jamaica Conservation Development Trust. One of the things that is very important in terms of resilience is the whole question of protecting our environment, and in particular our forests. Because when you have major hurricanes, etc., if you don't have proper forest cover, you know the situation. If you look at what happens in Haiti and in many other countries, the landslides and the various other things affect us. Now, that is affecting us somewhat in Jamaica. But I do believe that we need to set aside some funding for the support of the protection of the environment and the forests in particular. And part of the funding needs to look at, for instance, carbon trading and how we can begin to access funding for the protection of these areas. I think the World Bank has done a lot of work in that area, and certainly Jamaica could benefit from this, and we need to begin to plan for this.
Thank you very much. There's a question at this side, Carlene. No, over here to the left, gentleman.
This is one of 12 questions, so let me begin.
No, keep to one, please. Prioritize
My
one.
understanding is that Major Davis is the Chief Advisor to the Government on Disaster Mitigation Policy, correct? Major Davis, you are the Chief Advisor. That being said, my name is Christopher David Liu. I'm the current President of the Jamaican Institute of Architects. Minister Dr. Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance and the Public Service. What figure in the current budget 2018-2019 has been allocated for disaster resilience on our existing stock of public buildings that will be turning into shelters in the event of a disaster, being an earthquake or a hurricane? Hospitals, schools, community centers, what percentage of our budget in a figure has been allocated for disaster resilience, strengthening of these structures? Question one.
Thank you, Mr. Liu, for your question. And your question is exactly the purpose of this forum, right? That we're going to walk this policy through all the way to Parliament. I hope you're going to be there and supporting it. And the idea is that we begin to explicitly plan for the cost of natural disaster. Right, we have a general contingency in the budget, but that contingency deals with all kinds of contingencies. Where we need to go is that we have specific provisions that we use to purchase risk transfer products, as the case may be, or that we use towards fiscal savings via some natural disaster fund, and so on, as the case may be. You spoke about shelters, a very interesting and very appropriate example. On the resilience front, one of the things that we need to look at and need to be a part of our strategic approach is to what extent should we and can we afford, to have purpose-built shelters that would otherwise function as maybe schools or gymnasiums and so forth, that are at an appropriate level of resilience that can withstand a category X hurricane, whether X is 5 or 4. And so we know if something is coming, we can move people who are in vulnerable areas, in low-lying areas, mandatory evacuation, and they can go to one of several shelters across the island. These are things that we want to look at from a strategic perspective in the policy, and there's always, I will not use the word trade-off since Constance said there's no trade-off, but there's always there are always alternative ways of spending money that you have to consider. And those alternative ways require a national conversation in which voices like yours will be quite important. And this evening is one of those conversations.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, good evening. My name is Shannon Stevenson. I'm a law student from University of Technology. So my question today is, what does fiscal responsibility as it relates to the microeconomical front look like? Because we have an economy that is heavily dependent on, for example, tourism, which affects our tradesmen, our hoteliers, our farmers, tradesmen, men and women, and skilled workers. They are like the most impacted and hence the most vulnerable when it comes down to the effects of natural disasters. Being that they're not established businesses and physical resilience might be an issue, but they may be able to deal with that. But when it comes to financial preparedness, that is a big issue, because we have seen where just to start the business is a huge hurdle to cross. So how can we, with all these amazing policies as being mentioned, what does that look like? What can someone in this vulnerable space do to protect their livelihoods? Thank you.
Yes, Jorge wants to take. The mic.
I hear three questions that are related, and they are also related to my dilemma with respect to the geometric representation of resilience, right? Because if we had gone the 360 way, I would have added a couple of elements. And one of the elements is precisely the social dimension, no? where your question fits squarely. So let me tell you how it's dealt with exposed. No? So St. Martin, hit by a Category 5 hurricane last year, is exactly in the situation that you described. Lots of people lost their livelihoods. Many, I mean, they still have their jobs, but they are not really working because the hotels they used to work for have closed for a year. So how do you deal with that? Through an adaptive safety net. So through a conditional cash transfer, people are getting resources from a conditional cash transfer, and they are participating in training that will improve their human capital and will generate a benefit for the economy. So that would be an example of how you deal with the social dimension of this. Now, in the case of St. Martin, it's exposed, but it could have been ex ante. I mean, you could design a social protection system beforehand so that it kicks in the case of a disaster. And then the other question that is related is the one on protection of natural resources, which is another dimension of resilience, which is very, very important. The gentleman that brought it to the room mentioned forests, but the same would apply to mangroves, for example. No? So those are clearly, so maybe we should stick with the circle and not the pillars, but one never knows.
Yes, Major Davis.
I would just like to add that one of the fundamental issues that will have to be addressed in small island developing states like ours, and those that are heavily dependent, for example, on tourism, is the diversification of the economy. If we don't go there, we are going to die. When sugarcane was king, we were king. Sugarcane left us. Then banana became king. Banana left us. And I'm saying that unless we wake up to the reality of it's cassava now? I hear you. I hear you. But the diversification of our economy is going to be our lifeline. Thank you.
Yeah. We have another panelist who wants to answer this question. Your question was a very well formulated, actually like 3 or 4 questions. Very skillful.
I think it was an exceptionally good question, and the important thing is that we, in conversations like these, sometimes we forget the social dimension. Two good examples that come to mind is with conditional cash transfer is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a very complicated system of drought early warning system, and they have identified the vulnerable households in communities that may bounce in and out of the safety net program. So when there is a drought early warning alert, that the country looks at the hotspots of vulnerable households and begins to ramp up the social safety net programming. And the international community joins by supplementing the Ethiopian social safety net programming with that type of example. But I just wanted to underscore, again, and reinforce the social dimension. I mean, I've just come back from a visit to New Orleans. The IDB organizes these cutting-edge learning sessions, and we were able to go to meet with city officials and local NGOs, etc. And the strong thing that came out of that whole experience was that 13 years on, post-Katrina, in most developed country, one of the most developed countries in the world with all the resources, they are still struggling with recovery. And so recovery is something that I think that in that tension between resilience and risk transfer, that there has to be a strong focus on social recovery? And how do you engineer that or facilitate that in your policy?
Thank you. And just to add, you know that Jamaica has a well-functioning conditional cash transfer system, and I know that there is thinking in the government of how to tweak, you know, this conditional cash transfer so that it could be more responsive and adaptable in cases of, you know, when disaster hits. So the good thing is that there is a good basis, and you can really adapt that system to provide assistance in case of disasters. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Sure.
High Commissioner? Yeah.
Yes, Laurie Peters, Canada's High Commissioner. I have a comment and a question. As a long-standing partner of Jamaica and one of the international community members who leans in significantly in this space, I can't tell you how heartening it is and how important it is to hear Jamaica's ownership on this. And the importance of knowing that you have a plan and a policy to which we can lean into. Because we're all wanting to make sure that what we're doing is meaningful and appropriate and significant, but we can't do that without your ownership and without your plans and policies. So thank you, indeed, very heartening. In terms of innovation and creativity, I wonder, and directed anywhere along the panel, I wonder what the thinking is around the private sector and how the private sector can be a player in this space. And we can look at this with a PPP approach as well to extend the international community contributions, but also Jamaica's investment in this area. Thanks.
Thank you. Minister Clark?
I'll probably go first. That's an excellent question, High Commissioner. And we can look at it from many ways. One of the ways in which I look at it is the penetration of insurance in Jamaica is extremely low. In the private sector, I know a little bit about insurance. We had an insurance company in the group. And the percentage of Jamaican households, if you just look at household insurance, the percentage of Jamaican households that are insured is probably about 20%. And by insured, I mean fully insured. And that is a problem. That's a public problem. That problem is not only a problem for the individual, but it's a problem for the state. Because when severe damages occur, ultimately it gets transferred. And if you think about the fact that we have a number of people who live in irregular settlements and irregular communities, there was a study done in 2010 which estimates it at 1 in 5, or in terms of Jamaicans, a significant number. The vast majority of people who live in irregular settlements are uninsured. And persons who live along gully banks and so forth. So one of the things that the private sector, I've heard a couple of companies speak about, is seeing that as a huge market opportunity and trying to innovate with micro insurance to take some of that, using the profit motive being the catalyst there. And the government will have has an interest in seeing that happen. With respect to other, I guess another way of looking at it is to what extent capital markets here would be interested in looking at the risk from another perspective. Capital markets getting involved in risk mitigation. I don't know if our markets are deep enough as far as that is concerned. We could also seek to get more participation from international sort of insurance firms to be operating locally. So if we talk about the private sector, local and international, those are just some of my thoughts as an immediate reaction.
Thank you. And
so if we go through all the different elements of building resilience, I think that the private sector has a role to play in each and every one of them. No? First of all, building resilience is an issue that should involve society as a whole. It's not just a government issue. It's an issue that affects individuals and certainly the private sector. So on better preparedness, the private sector needs to prepare as well. And there are issues that go from making sure that the infrastructure, which is managed and owned by the private sector, should be resilient on its own right, to having the appropriate procedures to deal with disaster. On the social front, helping people with their livelihoods, these conditional cash transfer programs that I was describing, they were done in St. Martin, are being done in partnership with the private sector, because the private sector also wants to make sure that whatever training comes together with the program is going to be useful to generate human capital that will create more value for the economy as a whole. On the financial side of things, on the risk management side of things, I think that the private sector has a role to play in the design of new instruments, and then these are market-based solutions. So we will need the involvement of reinsurance companies, we will need the involvement of funds, intermediaries, to make this work and to keep the momentum in terms of the evolution and innovation in the financial instrument front. So I do think that there's and of course public-private partnerships. In a time when there are fiscal constraints, there is a need to strengthen infrastructure. I'm not advocating for anything, but if you have a publicly owned airport, maybe a way to increase the speed of strengthening the airport is by going into a PPP and making the resilient aspect of it part of the deal with the company that's going to manage the piece of infrastructure.
Thank you. Just one major point, David.
Ladies and gentlemen, just to say that whereas because of where I sit, my focus from time to time might be on the recovery of the organizations of the state. True, that might be the case. But I'm convinced that we cannot have a recovery from any shock without the private sector recovering. It is the recovery of the private sector that is going to cause the rest of us to recover. There's no recovery for Jamaica after a shock without the intimate and full involvement of the private sector. And so there is a policy of embracing the private sector. It is something that I don't think we do enough of, but we have to, because your contribution is critical to our recovery.
Galina, if I may, just 30 seconds. The way I would think about this is in terms of complementarity, because when you think about risk, you have macro risk, aggregate risk, that the government is in charge of, and I think the government of Jamaica has been doing a fair deal of that. And you have the personal idiosyncratic risk. So I'm hopeful that as the government continue to insure Jamaican against aggregate risk, they will be more driven to actually insure against idiosyncratic risk.
Thank you. My timekeeper is telling me that I have to close, but I don't think that it's fair to close before giving a warning that this is going to be the last question. So, one last question.
Okay, good evening. I'm Shamoy McLean from the Statistical Institute of Jamaica. And I wanted to know, you spoke about we have to get it down to the people. What are the plans in place to sensitize the general public about this, the 20% insurance and so forth? And secondly, are there any plans in the policy to deal with agricultural insurance? Because agriculture contributes a significant amount to GDP. So what is there in relations to agricultural insurance?
Well, again, excellent questions. Boy. I mean, I wanted to go on the X Factor, but now, now I'm kind of wondering. So, agriculture. One of the things that we want to do with agriculture is to make it more resilient. Agriculture is so important to our economy. The correlation between agricultural performance and overall economic performance is very, very high. As agriculture grows, Jamaica grows. If agriculture falls, Jamaica falls. Right. And we have so much rain at some times and then so much drought at others. Mm-hmm. If we had more resilience in our infrastructure, that would not be a problem because we would have irrigation, right? We would be able to store crops when there are bumper crops because we've had good rainfall and so forth. We are at the moment doing a major irrigation project in the Essex Valley that the EU is behind through the CDB. And that project stands to make us a lot more, St. Elizabeth is the breadbasket of Jamaica. So it plans to make us a lot more resilient in agriculture in response to the weather as far as rain and drought are concerned. As far as insurance for agriculture is concerned, we have started a crop insurance program. I don't want to oversell it as to where we are, but we have started, and that is good. The idea is to move from the level that we're operating at with respect to crop insurance to a higher level. With respect to involving the public at large, that's exactly where we're having this forum. I mean, disaster, risk, and so forth, climate is not the kind of topic that you have lights for. Right? It's the kind of thing you discuss, away from the lights. So the mere fact that we're taking this topic and putting it in a forum like this means that we're going to be taking a different approach because we have to deal with this differently. We begin here with this public forum. The Cabinet has approved a policy process which will involve stakeholder consultation at the national level and at the regional and local levels. The policy will have 10 objectives, and one or two of those objectives involve making sure that at the local authority level, at the parish level, resilience and planning for disasters are a part of our public investment approach and our approach to policy in general. We expect to have further public engagements during the policy-making process and for it to culminate with a parliamentary action, i.e. the policy to be tabled in Parliament and for there to be a public debate or public forum where representatives can speak of how the policy is likely to address their particular constituency. So the answer to your question is that we, by virtue of having this public forum 2 days after the Cabinet approved the drafting of a policy, speaks to our commitment to public engagement as far as this is concerned.
Thank you. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, I just wanted to leave you with what for me are 4 takeaways, from the discussion today. First is that the resilience agenda is multidimensional. There are different dimensions of resilience, and whether we call it a 360 or different pillars, it doesn't matter. The point there is that, there is social resilience, there is financial, fiscal, environmental, and all of them are important. And therefore, it's also very important to have a strategic approach so that you know how you prioritize, how you address these different aspects of resilience, because otherwise it's really overwhelming. And so that's one. Second is that the discussion really underscored the need to have a joint effort, of the public sector and the private sector, and then resilience and addressing this risk is the job of everyone, be it at an individual level, but very, very importantly, the role of the government and the private sector, and particularly in situations like, Jamaica, where there is a fiscal constraint, the very, very strong need to bring the private sector and market approaches, to the resilience agenda. Third point is that the discussion brought, that there is a menu of options, or there are many different instruments out there, and different countries are trying different things. The possibility of innovating and pushing the envelope is also there. And what is really important is that all these different products and instruments are adapted to the specifics of each country, and there is a comprehensive menu of options, or a comprehensive suite of products, as we say, to address the issues in a concrete country. And the last point is that Jamaica has been really at the forefront. Jamaica has done the homework. And the development partners have been with Jamaica, through these years, but now it's up to us, again, to support strongly Jamaica for the sake of Jamaica and the developments of Jamaica, but also to create the model and create the example, for the rest of the Caribbean. So join me in thanking our distinguished panel. And I turn now to Mr. Trevor Anderson for the vote of thanks. Maybe we should join. And there's something sizzling already in the corner. So please stick around, for the cocktail and the reception to continue that discussion.
Testing, testing. Can you hear me? All right. This certainly was an excellent event, and the breadth of information shared demonstrates that the government and our partners at the World Bank are committed to the business of planning and developing mitigating strategies for natural disasters that could have a deleterious effect on the economic growth agenda. I feel privileged to have been tasked to move the vote of thanks. I know and I suspect that you all feel the same as I do, energized and encouraged by the discussions that took place and the presentations that were made. We are heartened by the sheer numbers that have turned out to attend this forum today. Our speakers were powerful. Thank you, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, our Minister of Finance and the Public Service, for stimulating our minds as you created the context that allowed us to ruminate on the government's agenda. Jorge Familiar, with heartfelt gratitude for sharing valuable insights from an international perspective. We hope you will find a little time to experience our warm island hospitality. our moderator, Galina Sotirova, World Bank Country Manager. Sincere appreciation to you, as you certainly kept the discussions between our panelists connected, and you did so with ease and poise as you navigated the discussions so well that we could all follow. Mr. Sheen Said, Country Director for the Caribbean, you effortlessly provided us with an overview which excited our minds for what was to come. And our very own Loris Jarrett, Deputy Financial Secretary and Acting Financial Secretary in the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, who graciously welcomed all of us to what is now a positively unforgettable event. A public forum on facing fiscal risk of natural disasters. Thanks to both of you. I would be remiss if we did not express our appreciation to the team at JIS for authenticating this public forum as an all across the world event. People could join in the discussion and share in the experience. Thank you, JIS. To our panelists, we thank you for a invigorating discussion, and a discussion which, stimulated our minds and provided us with further food for thought. To the team at Nationwide, we are grateful to you as you presented the public forum in prime time on radio. So many Jamaicans and those who joined your station online could benefit from the discussion. To the wider media, you provided coverage so that the nation could remain informed as after the event has concluded. Thank you for continuing to tell our good story. And to you all, it certainly would not have been the same if we had spoken to empty chairs. So thanks to you for coming out in your numbers. We recognize that you were engaged, and we commit to continuing the discussion. We ask of you one thing and one thing only. Please, please go and share the information so that many more may be informed. Ladies and gentlemen, the logistics of the event was well coordinated, and I am sure you would agree the public forum was executed with excellence. And as such, we express gratitude and appreciation to the technical communication team from the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, our partners, the World Bank, Sparkle's event planners, technical support from the World Bank, and guidance from the leadership at the ministry. Have a great evening. Cocktails follow. Thank you.